This is the third installment of the Disasters series. If you missed the previous episodes, I recommend you to check them out. The link's in the description. Without further ado, let's start with another disastrous year of 1994. As always, handpicked, translated and narrated by your host, Anthony. After a year of plane and train crash, ferry disaster, and gas explosion up and down the country in 1993, it finally reached the capital Seoul in 1994. Seongsu, one of the major bridges across the Han River that first opened in 1979, failed. It was not the biggest disaster from the time in terms of lives lost, but the image of the failed bridge in the heart of the capital became an iconic image in people's mind. On October 24th, in the busy morning rush hour, about 50-meter length deck of Seongsu failed and plunged down to the river carrying 3 cars with it. It took barely 20 seconds to happen, and cars running towards the failed section could not stop in time. 3 more cars fell, followed by, most tragically, a commuter bus full of passengers. The bus flipped and landed on its top, crumpling the vehicle. Only 2 survived out of 31 in the bus, and overall 32 people perished, including 9 young students. Tragically, the father of one of the young victims later committed suicide in front of the memorial of the victims, adding one more life lost to the disaster. The trial on the disaster dragged on for 7 years and concluded the biggest blame was the inadequate construction already from the designing stage to the details of its construction. But the authority could not escape the responsibility either for having failed the regular safety test and maintenance and for having ignored the early warning signs. The bridge was demolished and new bridge was opened in 1997 in the same spot. Now, here's 2 short stories regarding the Seongsu Bridge collapse. In one girls' high school, a student was suffering depression. People around her often heard her sighing and saying, "I don't want to live. I'd rather die." Once she even consulted a teacher about her constant thought of suicide, but the teacher just thought it was a typical teenage girl's drama and didn't do anything more than telling her some empty words of encouragement. But not long after, she killed herself by jumping off from the Seongsu Bridge. By some witness account, she must have regretted her choice after jumping off and hung onto the bridge structure a while before she fell to her death. Her schoolmates got all restless and nervous. Their mate's death itself was a shock, but there was also a rumor going around rampant that their teacher had a dream of the dead girl, telling him, "I can't go alone. I'm too lonely. I need some company to come with me." A few days later, the dream became reality. Seongsu Bridge collapsed and many students perished with it. It's a story my teacher told us during a class. She got her driving license just then and was driving to work that morning. Then just before she drove onto Seongsu Bridge, the car suddenly stalled. Still a newbie driver, she didn't know what to do. The line of cars stopped by her got quickly longer, and many of them started banging their horn aggressively. And just then, with a loud crushing noise, a section of the bridge failed right in front of our eyes. Everybody came out of their car and looked at it in disbelief. After the initial shock, the drivers behind my teacher all thanked her that she saved their life. I've already made a dedicated episode about the collapse of Sampoong Department Store. If you missed it, do check it out. The link's in the description and at the corner of the screen. And yet, this disaster remains the most iconic of all the disasters from the mid-90s that I had to bring it back one more time. It was not only the single biggest disaster since Korean War in terms of lives lost, but the symbolic image that the luxury store that represented the nation's growing wealth in ruins, and the grueling rescue effort that was broadcasted in real time for nearly a month, left a lasting trauma to the public. The sheer number of stories, urban myths, and rumors still floating around after nearly 30 years proves that. So, here's one more story about the collapsed department store. It's already a long time ago, but I still remember it like yesterday. My family home was not far from the infamous Sampoong Department Store. We could easily walk over there, and indeed we often did. To my young eyes, the department store looked fabulous. The open atrium central hall was grand, and it had something for everybody. I could spend a good long time at the bookshop in the basement while Mom looked around the supermarket area, for example. That day too, Mom, I and my older sister were on our way to Sampoong. The plan was to meet Dad there after the shopping and dine out together. So we were just waiting at the crosswalk, and the moment the signal changed to green, a taxi rolled in and stopped right in front of us, blocking our way. None of us waved for it, though taxi drivers are not known to be the gentlest of the drivers, but it wasn't usual at all that it should block people from crossing. Stranger thing was, we three just took the taxi, as if we were waiting for one. Just a moment before we were talking about what to shop at Sampoong, but we just got on the taxi. And almost instantly we changed our plan to go to another department store a few blocks down. When we got there, I was the last to get off. I closed the door behind me, and I remember it closed with a loud bang because it was an old car. But when I looked back a second later, that taxi was gone. In retrospect, the whole thing didn't make sense, but we behaved as if everything was normal and went on with the shopping. While we were looking around, I sensed certain uneasiness in the air. We heard somebody mentioning Sampoong had collapsed, but Mom thought it should be just some ceiling tile had failed or something like that. Only when we reached the electronics department and joined the salespeople gathered in front of the large TV, we finally saw the scale of the disaster and could understand what the sound of emergency cars and helicopters passing by in the distance was about. Weird thing was, it wasn't just us. Dad was to meet us at Sampoong before it collapsed. But before he could leave his office, phones started ringing. When he picked them, nobody said anything. But phones rang one after another from left, right and center, and that kept him in the office for a good while. Then he heard about Sampoong collapse from his car radio and panicked, thinking we should be under the rubbles. We don't know what the taxi was and why we all played along as if under hypnosis, or who called Dad's office. I'm just thankful somehow something saved my family from the disaster. By the time of the disaster of Sampoong Department Store, nobody could deny something was systematically wrong with the country. And the ominous foreboding came true with a bang. In late 1997, the Pan-Asian financial crisis reached South Korea. Up until that point, Korea's economy never stopped growing since 1960s. In the 90s, it reached its peak, growing by the neck-breaking speed of 9% annually. Aggressive expansionism based on borrowed money worked fine so long the economy kept growing, but the moment it slowed, it crumbled down like a house of cards. By December, it turned out the country had 5 times larger foreign debt than its foreign exchange reserves. The nation's credit rating fell from AA- to B-, and the value of Korean currency fell overnight. In the end, the government took the bailout of $55 billion from the International Monetary Fund under the condition to accept its demand for radical restructuring.
$35 billion in immediate support within the procedures and policies to the program of Korea.
It was dubbed as the worst national disaster since Korean War, and many Koreans will still colloquially call this period as the IMF period. The impact was swift and brutal. In a matter of a year, 1 million businesses were said to have gone bankrupt. From the 30 biggest companies in 1997, only 11 of them managed to stay on the list today. Countless people became the victim of cutbacks and restructuring and lost their job and career. Some estimates about 60% of all households were affected in one way or the other. Many families still relied solely on the income of the father, and stories went around of a father who could not tell his family he lost his job, still pretending to go to work as usual and spend the day wandering in park in his full business suit. Or even a desperate and despaired father killing his family and himself. In December 2000, it was officially declared that the loan from IMF was paid back, which was 4 years earlier than the initial projection. The harsh 3 years had its gains. The industries became more global, business practices became more realistic and solid, and corrupt connection between politics and business became weaker. But at the same time, the losers of the IMF period, whether it be an individual or a company, never fully recovered. Job market has become more stringent, and the gap between the winners and losers has become wider. The biggest thing is the euphoria and optimism of the previous era is lost forever. And now, here's one story from the IMF period, most likely a made-up story, but nevertheless reflecting the mood and situation of the time. A story which a friend's friend says he experienced, so make what you will. During the economic crisis of 1997, the small company he worked for too fell into a hard time. Several people were fired as a part of effort to downsize, and one of them was Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee was known to be a hard worker and upright character, but probably a bit too upright for his own good in this case. He didn't bend principles and set his mind straight, and his colleagues talked among themselves that the owner of the company didn't like him for that. Mr. Lee's wife was then expecting a child in a month, and his aging parents were dependent on him too. He begged the owner to keep him, if must for less salary. When it was in vain, he asked at least to tell him the reason of the dismissal, but the owner refused to explain anything. Mr. Lee desperately searched for a new job, but when even big companies were going bankrupt all around and the jobless rate nearing 9%, it was impossible. And in the end, Mr. Lee threw himself into Han River. And since when, rumor started going around among the company staffs that they saw the ghost of Mr. Lee when they worked at night. Some said they saw him in the toilet, others said at the corner of the office. The owner simply huffed and told his employees to stop spreading the nonsense. But the rumor only grew, and people started refusing to work into late hours. In the end, the owner decided one day to stay in the office himself and work into night. Staffs made excuses and left one by one, and by the midnight, he was left alone. Suddenly, the light in the office flickered. The owner didn't care much and turned his desk lamp on instead. But the next moment, the ceiling light went off altogether, followed by the desk lamp. The owner stood up from his desk to check the fuse box, when he saw some whitish figure at the corner of the office. He realized it was at the desk that used to belong to Mr. Lee. Before he could react, the screen of the computer there popped on, followed by the sound of typing on the keyboard. The owner had to accept that the rumor was true after all. He lost all his courage and was frozen stuck there. Until a few minutes later the lights came back on. The owner finally conjured up enough guts to go over to the desk at the corner. When he read what was written on the computer, he could not help himself from shivering all over. And when the reflection of what looked like Mr. Lee's face was shown on the screen, he finally fainted. In the morning, a staff who came the first found the owner passed out in front of the desk at the corner. And on the computer screen was written a sentence. "Why did you fire me?" In the episode 43, I introduced you the gas explosion disaster in 1993 that took place in Metro in Daegu City. Sadly, 10 years later, Daegu Metro became the stage of yet even bigger disaster. February 18th, 2003. Time was just heading 10 in the morning, and the metro train entering Jungangno station in Daegu was still reasonably busy just past the peak morning rush hour. A 56-year-old man, later named Kim Dae-han, was amongst the passengers. He was suffering severe depression after his stroke rendered him half paralyzed. He was carrying a 2-liter bottle of gasoline, intending to kill himself publicly. He lighted the bottle when the train stopped at Jungangno station, but when his clothes caught on fire, he dropped the bottle in the train and ran away. In a matter of seconds, the cabin was engulfed in flames. Fortunately, the train had already stopped at the station with its doors opened, so the majority of the passengers could still escape. The initial effort to control the fire with the extinguisher was failed, and the underground platform was quickly engulfed in fire, heat, and toxic black smoke. But the already terrible tragedy was to become a major disaster due to the series of little human errors that followed. The central control failed to register the seriousness of the situation and merely radioed other trains to take caution in approaching Jungangno Station and didn't actively stop the traffic. So another train full of passengers entered into the platform from the opposite direction as normal. Only when the doors were opened, which let thick smoke float in, the driver saw the dire situation and closed the doors quickly. But the central control still didn't understand the situation and ordered the driver to wait, and in turn the driver announced to the passengers to calmly wait inside till the train moved again. While the precious first couple of minutes passing, fire spread it to this train too, and the power and radio started failing, making it impossible to move again. 5 minutes passed, and the control center finally ordered to let passengers out. But by then, the system was failing, and not all the doors opened. Another 5 minutes, the control center ordered the driver to shut the train and evacuate. The driver pulled out the master key, and that automatically closed all the cabin doors, trapping the passengers who couldn't escape yet. The fire was started as a sabotage of a lone man, but as with any major disaster, this incident too is an outcome of an accumulated negligence and little human factors. There was no clear regulation about bringing a dangerous and flammable substances into public transportation. The interior of a metro train was not fitted with fire-resistant materials. The public was not properly informed about the emergency procedures, most notably how to open the train doors manually. The drivers, staffs, and the central control were all woefully untrained for an emergency. Fire was out by 1:38 p.m. What left were the station charred black and piles of bodies. Some were so burnt that they could not even perform a DNA test to identify. The final estimation is 192 dead, 6 of which remains unidentified, and 151 injured. Many survivors suffer lingering physical damage and PTSD to this day. Jungangno Station opened again after 10 months, but many commuters reported weird smell and black stains on the walls of the station for years on afterwards. The arsonist, Kim Dae-han, was sentenced to life imprisonment, but died of fatal stroke less than a year. This disaster remains the second most fatal underground metro accident in the world. Now, here are 2 little stories and 1 heartbreaking account about the Daegu Metro fire disaster. A woman was experiencing a difficult labor in childbirth. The situation got critical, and doctors decided to perform an emergency cesarean section under general anesthesia. And while unconscious, the woman had a strange dream. In the thick fog appeared a shadowy figure. As she approached, she realized it was a Grim Reaper, beckoning her to come to him. She was scared, but her legs kept moving against her will. Now within the arm's reach, the Grim Reaper was about to hold the woman's hand. And just then, another Grim Reaper rushed in.
"What are you doing here? We've got a lot to do. Come follow me quickly."
And 2 Reapers disappeared into the fog, murmuring, "So much to do, so much," among themselves. When she got around, she found herself in the recovery room, surrounded by her husband and other family members. The operation was successful and a healthy baby was born. With a relief, woman talked about her dream. Her mother and sister seemed a bit alarmed, but her husband just laughed it off and turned on the TV as to change the subject. And on TV was a breaking news about the fire in Daegu Metro station and its hellish scenes. Could that have been why the Grim Reapers was so busy? It's what my high school PE teacher told us. It was from the time he was preparing the test to become a teacher. He attended the cram school in Daegu for that every day. One morning he had a dream. He saw a man whom he thought as a friend for some reason. The man was standing in front of two houses. One was a grand villa and the other dilapidated hut. And he chose the hut to enter. My teacher wanted to stop him, but somebody grabbed his shoulder, saying,
None of your business.
When he turned around, he found it was a man all in black, giving off an oppressive vibe. Teacher stepped away and took a taxi to get away from the man. The taxi took a turn and ran into an alley, and teacher found all the houses along the alley were in mourning, with the undertaker's lanterns on.
They all died at the same time,
the taxi driver said.
And you are one of them,
he added and turned to look at the teacher. The driver was the same guy in black he saw earlier. Teacher woke up from the nightmare in all sweat. He could not shake off the ominous feeling and for once skipped the cram school. And later in the day, he turned on the TV and saw the breaking news about the fire in Metro Station, the exact station he would have gotten off to go to his cram school. When the station was reopened later, he saw there was a little memorial corner set up with photos of the victims. And his eyes caught one face. It was the man who went into the crumbling hut in his dream. By 2003, many people carried mobile phones, and some of the last messages and calls from the victims of the Metro fire surfaced. Now, I'm a storyteller and have been trying to portray various emotions in the stories, but I feel somehow too shallow and disrespectful to act out the last words of the dead. So I would just show you the last messages without narration. Hi, it's Anthony here, and thank you very much for listening. At the beginning of this disasters series, I said I wanted to draw a kind of an alternative history of modern Korea. I don't know if it achieved it or not, but what I wanted to say is Korea has been no different from the rest of the world outside a handful of powerful nations. It was colonized and left exploited and conditioned to doubt our own identity and self-worth. It suffered abject poverty for decades. It was ruled by a series of power-hungry dictators, and people had to fight a bloody battle towards democracy. It even experienced a brutal civil war. Even after its economic growth, various disasters revealed undeniable ills of the society, namely corruption and negligence, which in the end resulted in major financial crises that nearly toppled economic progress. In that sense, the history of disasters in modern Korea could be a cautionary tale. And yet, people didn't give up. People worked hard to survive. They fought for justice and right. As a result, Korea has become a functioning democratic society and a safer nation. It now sits within world top 10 for its economic and military power and entertains the world with its soft power too in recent years. When the world is still dominated by the countries that were powerful and colonized the rest of the world 100 years ago, Korea is a rare exception, and in that sense, Korea could be an example and a model despite of its all lingering social challenges. If you enjoyed my work, please give it a like and a comment, and please consider subscribing to my channel to help my little channel grow. If you'd support me more directly, I also have a Buy Me a Coffee account. The link's in the description. Buy Me a Coffee supporters will get an early access to my new videos. Thank you. I think I'll be back with a more usual episode next Sunday. Stay safe and take care.